option is like to regulate what's there as opposed to like banning everything. Something as simple as that, like, you know, feeds for under-16s, you're not allowed show ads, or you're not allowed, you know, kind of use algorithms for the content. It's just isolated to them and like their friends and family or whoever it is, so they're not being bombarded by external stuff.
Hello and welcome to the ProfileTree Podcast. My name's David. I'm a web developer here at ProfileTree, and I'm joined by Emer and Porrick from the client services team. In today's podcast episode, we're going to talk about the new legislation that might be coming into play in the UK. This is in relation to banning social media platforms for people or children, obviously under 16. So it's not in place yet. They're going to discuss it around Christmas time this year, 2026, but then it will be going in force if it does get passed in spring 2027. This will include things like Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram, which you'd be, kind of expecting, Facebook, but it's also going to include YouTube, so it's interesting, and Twitch as well. So just gonna ask you guys, have you heard about this ban? What do you think this is gonna do in terms of like the impact it's gonna have for, you know, digital marketing and also just in general in the UK?
Yeah, so I heard about it quite recently, and I think it is interesting because the UK's proposal is going slightly further in some areas than, for example, Australia, where this is already enforced. They're restricting features such as live streaming and contact with strangers on any online services, which obviously sounds like a very positive thing, in my opinion, for people under the age of 16, because other than situations where it's being regulated by a parent, I don't really see a lot of reason why a child should be in contact with strangers online. If it's something like to do with school where it's being monitored by the school or by teachers, that's obviously fine. But in everyday, use of the internet, I don't think that's something that under 16s really should be using. So in that way, I do think it's quite a positive thing. Um, I also think it's quite interesting that 90% of parents do support the ban, because a lot of kids, I know you touched on YouTube being one of the things that would be impacted by this. A lot of kids would obviously use YouTube to learn and, for different educational materials. So I think it is interesting. I could see it from a parent's perspective in that they want their children to be safe when they're browsing online. But I do think a lot of online resources then may come into play of not being able to be used if it's the case that children under 16 aren't allowed to use these things. That could obviously play a part with things like education and actual beneficial things that under 16s may be using online.
I think YouTube is probably the biggest one for me that I was shocked when I heard about, because I feel like a lot of people use it. So I'm not too sure how it's gonna come into play. Is it gonna be just you can't use it logged out? You can use it with an account, or is it completely banned for people under 16? Or are they gonna create a new platform? Because obviously they have YouTube Kids, which isn't gonna be banned, but it's I think aimed at like very young, like under 5. So or 6, 7, I'm not too sure. But for the other demographic that they're gonna lose, I wonder if they're gonna maybe bring in maybe YouTube education or something. It'd be interesting to see. But I do think that for me is the most shocking one is the YouTube aspect. I do agree. I think TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, I do think that there's value in them being banned.
I think like the general idea or sentiment behind it has like the right meaning, and there is like an idea, like it's obviously an issue, like kids spend too much time on it, like, you know, they're talking to strangers, it becomes addictive. There's a lot of bullying on platforms, or, you know, it can lead to like self-esteem issues, you know, from like image, like body image and everything like that. There definitely is like a lot of problems out there, and like, you know, it is, I suppose, maybe not a step in the right direction, but, you know, it's positive to see action about it. But I do wonder, is it, you know, it's a big sweeping kind of piece of legislation that, you know, or we ban it for under-16s, like this is going to absolutely solve everything, and like that's the end of it, and like that's going to change everything. I think, you know, there's a lot of problems there, but will this solve it? Or like, I feel like it's going to have a lot of unintended consequences and possibly make things worse. Like if you think of, you know, one of the big issues of like kids talking to strangers online, they're, say it's happening on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, and you ban kids from it, you're, that's all right, that's the problem solved. But does that lead kids to then try to use VPNs, or, you know, there's other like social media networks or platforms? Because likely what will happen is like Facebook will be banned for under-16s, another platform will spring up that'll get banned, but it'll probably just go on repeat every 6 months. So they're then moving on to like unlicensed platforms that don't have, like Meta or Facebook have their head offices in Dublin, and the government kind of interact with them and see, and there's data protection and everything on it. But suddenly there's like a black market platform that all kids are using, and it's completely free reign, and like obviously predators and everything can kind of join that as well. So you're kind of pushing things into like not a black market, but kind of away from any supervision. So on paper it looked great. There's no under-16s using social media platforms, but they're all secretly have some sort of app on their phone that they're using, and there's no regulation or like anything oversight in that. So I think doing something about it is the right idea, but I'm not sure like this is probably the best course of action. Or there's a lot of things I think it sounds really good politically, like we're going to ban it for under-16s, but like has there a lot of thought gone into this, like what you're saying, David, that there's like obviously educational platforms, like parts of YouTube, obviously there's just regular YouTube, and it's not all educational, but like there's aspects of that. I'm sure like every other platform or stuff that will get banned will have unintended consequences. I just don't think it's probably the best thought through plan, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good point about the it basically just pushing people to find another platform. Because I do feel like the first if it does get introduced, like the first 10 years are probably the most are going to be the hardest years, because obviously people are used to using the platforms, especially like TikTok, because it's so addictive. It's kind of like, I know it's a weird comparison, but the way they did the cigarette ban, and obviously that only really applies for all the future children. So like I feel like this ban, if they do come into play, like it will be more effective. It'll be more effective in the future rather than at the start, because like people will kind of grow up not knowing that they can access it. Whereas at the minute when they've had access and you're taking it away from them, they'll try and find
I think the
other
cigarette
options.
ban though as well. Well, like you ban it, well, obviously for under-18s, but part of like restricting everything on cigarettes and that is it led into vaping, and suddenly then everyone under the age of 18 vapes. Like I think, I don't know if it was the same in the UK, but in Ireland, like only in the last year or two, they've banned the sale of vapes to under-18s because there was no like law in place. So like a child could go into a shop and buy a vape, and that's like only pretty recently been banned. So like I think that's a really good example of cigarettes are the problem. We're going to ban everyone from smoking cigarettes. Next thing, like vapes are invented, and like everybody you see on the street has one. So you're like
Yeah,
just pushing the problem somewhere else, and then you ban vapes. I don't know, like everyone has the Zyn things now as well. Like that's the newer thing. Like even though vapes aren't banned, but there's always going to be, something else that is kind of like a workaround for it. And vapes, like in that case, the same as teenagers or kids using like unlicensed platforms are probably worse than cigarettes, like the effects of vapes. So I feel like that's somewhat of a comparison in what in my head I think might happen as like a negative
yeah.
consequence of it.
Yeah, and I
'Cause
also think it's worth remembering that not all kids are using social media for harmful reasons. Like kids, use it to build friendships, things for school, like homework, doing research and educational purposes like that. For different learning opportunities, like we were saying, like YouTube, other platforms that maybe they're picking things up on. Um, Things like creative portfolios. Like obviously we don't know what this will span to in terms of which platforms it'll impact, but kids use social media for a lot of different things, and they pick up a lot of skills from social media as well, that taking it away from them could have quite detrimental impact. Like some kids would even use it as like a mental health tool, like if they're in forums and things like that where they're maybe speaking to people where they don't feel comfortable speaking to an adult or one of their friends or someone else that they know about. Taking away things like that, especially to kids like 16 and under, can seem like the end of the world to a child. So I think there are things that maybe need to be balanced out. Like you said, it definitely will have positives, and just blanketing and taking it all away and will lead kids to go to like unregulated spaces, and they'll use VPNs and they'll find ways around things like we all always have, and like everyone will do things like that. But even things like using their parents' devices, or using if like we don't know how these things are going to be verified, but kids will find a way around it, and it's just making sure that they actually have a safe way to be able to use these platforms. And it's just making sure as well that we're not taking away things that actually have benefits to these children.
Well, it's like if you have like Netflix or Amazon, wherever you have child locks on it, and there's over 18s films, I guarantee that like most teenagers are not waiting until they turn 18 to watch like a horror movie or something. Like they're gonna find, you know, a streaming another streaming platform, or like something like LimeWire or whatever, to like download it and watch it. They're already finding ways around stuff like that, where there's like blocks on watching content online, even just regular stuff like Netflix and that.
Yeah. Definitely. And that's where the things like VPNs will come into play, because most phone providers have free VPN apps. Like Apple has many free VPN apps that you can kind of get around these restrictions. If this is only a UK based restriction, all it takes is a child downloading a VPN and changing their location at the end of the day. So I think there's just a lot of things that'll need to be considered before they decide, and also looking at places like Australia and seeing how they've implemented it and what steps they've taken to kind of combat kids moving to unregulated platforms or spaces that could put them at even more risk.
And it kind of goes against like, I feel like, policies and stuff in other areas. Like, a thing now is like decriminalizing drugs. Because obviously, banning drugs and everything was not working. Like just pushing people, like, they're opening like injecting sites and like all this stuff to try and make it safer. And then in the injecting sites, like you can get help. Whereas like alternative is to ban it, and then people are down alleyways or like, in houses, like overdosing and stuff. But they seem, not in a way, like somewhat similar issues, but they're two very different approaches. Like governments have obviously realized like banning drugs like out clear doesn't work, because people are like, more and more people are taking drugs, like more people are having overdoses and stuff. So like they're trying to switch it to, let's make like these injection centers and like provide more like counseling. So if somebody gets arrested for like possession of drugs, it's not lock them up. It's like, let's put them in like a treatment program or something. So like it seems the counterintuitive, like that's the approach you're deciding to take on drugs, is like, let's like be more like wholesome and open and try and like guide people to like, you know, improvement and like the issues within it, and reversing outright bans or criminalization. Whereas then social media is the opposite, like let's ban it and criminalize it, where like you've seen the same tactics applied somewhere else with like drug use, and like that obviously hasn't worked, and it's been like that for like 50 years, and like, you know, countless people died and whatever. So like now it's like, let's try a different approach. So it's like, is this banning this for under-16s like a waste of, you implement this and like see after like 10 years it's not working, and then like switch to a different tactic, but like all the damage that's done in the meantime.
Yeah. And then I also think you would just be worried that the problems and the reasons for banning social media, so things like, poor mental health, bullying, exposure to harmful content, if we do outright ban these things and unregulated platforms do appear, obviously all of this stuff is just going to appear tenfold, because people can get away with it and no one is protecting them, and there's no regulations, and there's no one like monitoring what's going on these kind of new platforms. So that's the worry, that if you do just enforce a blanket ban, that these kind of different platforms will come up and kids will then be exposed to worse things than ever before, because
Yeah,
at least there's some accountability with social media, in that people have, I know obviously you can make fake profiles, but generally they're linked to an email address which can be tied, or a phone number which can be tied back to someone. But if brand new profiles and platforms are opening up, which are, the main thing is to kind of keep people completely anonymous because they're not supposed to be on these platforms in the first place, I think that opens up a lot of problems and a lot of like safety concerns and safeguarding concerns for under-16s that could be on these platforms. And, people who maybe are posing as under-16 who shouldn't actually be on these platforms, it's how you're actually going to make them child friendly and child safe is something they would need to consider.
I think as well, like back to like the unintended consequences and stuff. Like if you think of during COVID, like schools were closed for 2 years. If you had that ban in place, then like for like just a social aspect or social skills, like how would all of those kids under the age of 16 like spoke to their friends or like interact with them? So you would have, the mental health issues that might have come from that for like 2 years of pure isolation where they can't really talk or interact with their friends. I know obviously it's not great to be sitting inside your phone every day, but in cases like that where you couldn't go out and meet and socialize people, like that was their one connection to all their friends. So you can imagine like the damage that would have done of just like pure isolation with, just like their brother or sister, or if they didn't have any, like an only child, where it's just them and their parents trapped, so they're not interacting with like anybody in their age group or any of their friends for like months at a time.
Yeah, because just when you were talking about that, like obviously the big thing is like one of the reasons they're banning like those platforms and not ones like WhatsApp is to do with like the algorithm part of it. So I wonder if there's like maybe a compromise where it's kind of you don't get the algorithm version of the site or something along those lines
Yeah.
potentially as well, because then that way you could still have, because obviously like as you said, mental health and then also like hobbies or just anything like that. Like obviously, especially now because it's there's less social kind of thing for young people. So like I do think there is value in having it still, but obviously just the policing of it. But maybe that would be part of the algorithm would obviously help with the addictive part of it as well as like the mental health part of it, because obviously you're only seeing the people that you follow, kind of what it used to be when you use social media at the start, which is you only saw who you followed, and then that way you would still kind of get the best of both worlds. But then like, I know it's one of those things that's like a massive topic. It's like how you meant to choose who gets what when it comes to like
But
how
I
do
think
you
that's a better option is like to regulate what's there as opposed to like banning everything. Like that, it's something as simple as that, like feeds for under-16s. You're not allowed show ads or you're not allowed, kind of use algorithms for the content. It's just isolated to them and like their friends and family or whoever it is. So they're not being bombarded by stuff like external stuff.
I also find it interesting because obviously like content creation is such a big thing now for people like on social media. Like I feel like a lot of people start back when they're younger as well. So that's like a massive like subset of people just not doing that, which was maybe a good thing. I don't know, but kind of it's like a career path that a lot of
Well,
people have nowadays.
I did think this, but even what impact will this have on family bloggers, people whose children have been on in the social media eye since they've been born, and who then grow up and have their own platforms when they're like 10 or 11 or old enough to have a mobile. So I'm wondering how this will impact them as well, like families and people whose children are there and allowed to have their own platforms when they're a very, very young age. As you said, it is a career path at the end of the day. So it's not going to be viable, I guess, for under-16s unless they're doing it from like a burner account, at which point, obviously, I'm sure it won't be monetized in that brands aren't going to work with someone who's underage. The way that, children nowadays probably do get gifted things from brands, but brands wouldn't be allowed to do that if it's illegal. So that's also something to consider. It is a career path for a lot of people nowadays, and that'll definitely cut that option off for quite a few people.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of different like reasons why like there's good sides and bad sides to the ban for social media. As you said, Emer, like with it taking place in Australia, like one of the things is that whenever they put something in place, most of the time people just go around it anyway. So we'll have to just wait and see how it actually turns out, and see the impact it has on the digital marketing space, as it evolves too. But yeah, so thank you very much for joining for another episode of the ProfileTree Podcast. Please follow the podcast if you can, and we'll see you in the next one.